All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And again, we might hear just a brief moment of sound as more people join the call. But thank you all so much for joining us this morning. With all this sunshine, I know everyone, including me, are so excited to talk gardening. So first off, who's we? I'm Rachel Zerwin, and I'm the Community Programs Director at HC3. I focus on waste diversion, water conservation, and sustainable food. I also have additional teammates who work on climate action, energy efficiency, and business sustainability. And I know the person you're really here to listen to is my coworker, Kyla Laplante. So let's see. That's her in the right side of this photo. And she is the magic behind the Summit CSA. So CSA stands for Community Supported Agriculture, and that's HC3's farm share. So that means every summer people buy a share of the farm, and each week Kyla and her team produce 75 shares of incredible organic produce, all right here in Summit County. So I'll talk more about HC3 here in a second, but first I wanted to give a shout out to the library, who is our partner in this workshop. So although Summit County Library locations are closed, they are offering curbside pickup for materials at all 3 of their locations, and their book drops are open for returns. They have a ton of free digital resources, which I personally use the heck out of, including ebooks, videos, newspapers, and a bunch more. So the library is also offering other incredible virtual programs for all different ages. That's everything from trivia nights to story time. So visit them at summitcountylibraries.org, follow them on Facebook, or you can sign up for their newsletter. And then to shift back to HC3. So our work is focused locally here in Summit County. We're a nonprofit, and we've been around for more than 40 years. We help residents and businesses curb climate change and reduce waste. And a lot of people know us mainly for recycling. We help people understand how to recycle locally. And one of the ways to do that is food scrap recycling. So it's free to drop off food scraps, and those get turned into compost, so soil for your garden. And that all happens right here in Summit County at the scrap or the landfill. So we'll send out some details on how to sign up for that program, because enrollment is required, and we have free buckets that participants can use to collect their food scraps. We'll talk more about compost later on in the workshop, but that's a great and easy way to compost your food scraps. So that's one of several new recycling programs funded by Strong Future, which is a ballot measure that passed in 2018. And that's the reason that you also have free mattress recycling, carton recycling, and the Silverthorne drop-off. So beyond our work in recycling and climate, we help our community conserve water and energy, and we promote sustainable food, which is why we're here today. So when you pick up that organic spinach in the grocery store, it's probably from California, and it's traveling something like 1,200 miles or more to reach your plate. But you made the right choice today just by being here, because you're going to be crushing the organic spinach by the end of the season. And it's only going to be traveling from your backyard or the community garden. HC3 manages a few community gardens here in the county, and we're your resource to connect you with other local gardens. Again, we're going to get you some links at the end of this session, and we'll send a follow-up email with a bunch of resources. Still, visit us at highcountryconservation.org, and you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram. On our website, you can search pretty much anything to see if it's recyclable or not. So some great tools on there, and you can check out all the ways that you can commit to conservation here in Summit County. So I know you're ready for Kyla. That's who we're here for. I've got just a couple more housekeeping things. If for some reason we lose connection, we're of course going to try to get it back. And if we can't, we'll respond to RSVP questions individually, and then we'll get materials posted on our website. We're going to try to get to all your questions. Thank you so much for submitting those, because we got a lot of great ones. Kyla's going to address a lot of them throughout her presentation, and then others we'll get to after in a Q&A. So if you have additional questions throughout the presentation, use the chat function. There's an icon with a little speaking or a message bubble, and if you click on that, you can send a question to the host. That's me, Rachel. And then Kyla's going to leave some time for Q&A toward the end of the hour. So again, submit any questions that come up as she's talking. Thank you again all so much for tuning in this morning, and a huge thanks to all our supporters who make workshops like this possible. So if you could bear with me for just a second here, I'm going to kick it over to Kyla so we can focus on food and the real reason that you are here. So hang tight for me for just a second. And
All right. Can you hear me?
yep, we can hear you, Kyla. And we've got your screen up with site selection.
Hello?
Yep.
We hear you.
We can hear you. Okay.
Hello.
Hi, guys. Bear with me. Hi. It's my first time using this, so bear with me. I think I've got it figured out. Thanks for joining us. I'm just going to start with a few basics about growing food. It's a beginner gardening class, so I'm going to kind of roll through site selection and building a raised bed because I think some of you are already there. And like Rachel said, ask questions as we go along. And I'll do my best to answer all the questions. So without any more explanation, I'm just going to get going with the presentation. So the first thing to do when you're starting to grow vegetables, you want to select a site at your house. So some of you may want to be build a bed at your house or have a community garden plot. As you know, our sunlight is really strong here, but it's also super important to have adequate amount of light throughout the day. So minimum 6 hours of daylight wherever you're going to put your bed. Be aware of high wind zones. The wind here is really one of the big challenges that dries out the soil really quickly and can really make it difficult to grow anything. So kind of just walk around your yard, your site, wherever you want to put it and get a feel for where your wind is, where you might have buffer zones, where you can add some protection. Oops. And then drainage. If you're in a spot where you have like a giant snow pile that's draining into the bed, just be aware of that. You don't want it to be saturated in soggy water. We do have generally like good drainage around here because it's so dry, but you don't want to be putting your bed in a swamp, anything like that. Be conscious of shadows. If you're putting it near your house or adjacent to your house, don't put it on the north side, which is the shadiest part. You know, they recommend putting your bed probably 10 feet away from your house to avoid any shadows cast. And again, you can just kind of feel that out as the days get longer and kind of keep an eye on where your sun hits the most. Also, big thing you want to take caution is where's your water source? If you guys have a hose or you have a spigot at your house or you know, the community gardens are set up with that already, but just be aware of how you're going to get water to that bed and how convenient it is for you to get to the water source and to your bed. Because if it's not convenient, you're probably going to get tired of it pretty quickly. And if it's, you know, takes a long time or it's a hassle, just make it easy for yourself so you can just pop out there and water pretty easily. If you're gone, you can have a neighbor come and help you because that's really important. And I think it's one of the biggest challenges for home gardeners and for growing in general up here is just number one, to get your seeds to germinate and to keep your plot wet enough when the weather comes in and with the high, like the strong sun and the wind and stuff. So make that kind of a priority when you're deciding where to build that bed. And then voles, it's always an issue around here. Pretty easy to see at this time of year. When the snow's melting, you'll be able to see all the holes everywhere. It's probably going to be kind of daunting. I'm not going to get too much into vole stuff, but a few things you can do. So I'll get to that in just a second. When you start building the bed, find a spot, whatever works for you. The length of the bed is really however long you want to do it. Average size, I guess there's really no average. It depends on your space. Like 4x6 is pretty popular. The bigger thing is the width. So our 4-foot maximum is best. I wouldn't go anything under like 30 inches, 2.5 feet wide, just because you're going to be really limiting your space. But the reason why you want to do 4 foot wide is so that you can reach the bed all the way across and you don't have to walk in it. It's the average reach for a person is 4 feet max is like the comfortable spacing. So if you go beyond that, that's fine, but just know how you're going to get around and into the bed. And then the way you orient the bed. So up here, east-west collects the most heat. So again, it kind of depends on your space. If you have a greenhouse or a hoop house or anything like that, I would suggest doing it east-west, because that'll give you the most heat throughout the day overall. With the north-south orientation, you'll get sunlight coming in from the east and the west. And so if you have a lot of tall plants or trellising or anything like that, it's kind of whatever works for the space, and you can make do either way. But if you are building a greenhouse or want to do something a little more permanent, I would suggest doing east-west. If you have more questions about that, we can get into that another time. But the north-south just creates a lot of shading on the north end, and sometimes it can be hard to get enough heat and light back there, again, depending on your space. And then you want to keep that bed level. So big reason for keeping it level or being aware of a slope that it's on is watering. So if you're hand watering with a hose, and you're watering from if it's on the north-south slope, all the water is going to want to run downhill, obviously. So you want to kind of be aware of that, because that can really affect your germination. It can affect it can really make for uneven watering, and then that can just create even more of a challenge in a challenging environment. So do whatever you can to make that bed level. And so there's no pooling of water, so you're not flooding out plants and other plants aren't drying out. So that's pretty important. And then the big part about clearing your site, you want to clear out grass, weeds, if you have a tiller or just like a pickaxe or anything to kind of level out that surface, get rid of grasses. I definitely recommend using weed mat. Depending on how long you're going to be, if you live there at that house, I would invest in the heavy duty weed mat. They've got it at Lowe's. It has a green stripe on it. It's woven plastic. They have the other alternatives, which are kind of more like, they feel like felt material. But the voles will eventually chew through that. So it doesn't really last very long, maybe a couple of years at best, but we've done that before, and it's worth the extra bit of money to buy the heavy duty stuff. And as far as keeping those voles out, some preventative stuff you can do. There's a number of options at Murdoch's. You can peruse. Traps, I recommend traps for sure. I know some people are averse to that, but that's kind of just part of growing food. It's you against them, kind of. But other ways around that, if you don't want to use traps, you can use repellents. Fox, coyote, bobcat urines are available. Pmart, spelled pmart.com, is a good place to start. They've got all kinds of different urines. Hunters might be familiar with that. There's other alternatives you can use. These smoke bombs that are called giant destroyers. Again, the environmental aspects of that might not be to everyone's favor, but they do work, and you don't put them in the garden. But anyway, another way to keep those voles out once you kind of clean out your yard, and a big part of that too is cleaning your yard. So raking everything out, places that nests could be. I don't want to get too much into voles, but I know it's on everyone's radar. So you want to be, if there's any like wood piles or stashes or places that the voles are living, clean all that out as much as you can, mow your lawn. You just want to reduce their habitat, basically. So as much as you can do for that, like get rid of you know, if you have squirrel feeders and bird feeders, maybe put them up higher. Voles can't see very well, so they can smell really well. So that kind of stuff. And then, so the bigger part of excluding them from your bed is, again, to invest in some hardware mesh. So just that gridded metal, you can find it at hardware stores. The 1/4 inch is the size you want. You don't want to go any bigger than that because they can squeeze through anything that might be bigger than that. A cheaper alternative is metal flashing. Either way, they'll both work, but you want to make sure that you bury them probably like 6 inches into the ground, 4 to 6 inches into the ground, and then come up. They recommend 18 inches, but that seems excessive. I come up about 6 inches above the ground. And I guess I didn't touch on the height of the bed, so that's another important thing. You want to make sure your bed is about a foot tall to 18 inches, so 12 inches to 18 inches tall. A couple of reasons for that. It's going to keep you up off the ground a bit, so give you a little more insulation against frost and whatnot. And it gives you more volume for soil. And then if you're growing stuff like carrots and such, you don't want to have like a 6-inch tall bed. I mean, you can do it depending on if if you're just growing greens or whatever. But I would say 12 to 18 inches tall. And then keep in mind special needs. You know, if you don't like bending over, if you got a bad back or knees or whatever, build it to the height that you're comfortable at. Make it good for yourself so that it's enjoyable to go out there. So that's really preference based. Also keep in mind any, other special needs or whatever, wheelchairs, handicaps, stuff like that. And you can just pretty much build those beds according to your needs. But yeah, so back to the voles. So what I would do is, so you clean the space, you lay down the weed mat. Best way to secure the weed mat is to get, they're like 12 to 18 inch long ground stakes. They just look like big nails. They work the best here with the rocky soils. Anything else is pretty flimsy and might be a real pain to to secure down that weed mat. So that's what I recommend. And then on top of that, and to line inside your bed, you can put that hardware mesh or the metal flashing, secure it however, with staples. The mesh could be secured with staples and then flashing however you see fit. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you can use lumber. Don't use pressure treated wood. It's got carcinogens. It's just not, railroad ties and such. It's not recommended. If you have untreated wood that'll last for a good amount of time, you can buy all natural stain like Equal Wood. They've got some at Sherwin-Williams. It's online if you want to treat it. I wouldn't recommend painting it with toxic paint or anything like that. Make sure your screws and nails are the proper length. That's a big part of mess ups and beds that fall apart. You just want to make sure those screws are secure, and I have faith that you guys understand what that means. And then as far as hoops, I know this is probably a big question for all of you. Right now at the greenhouses, we're using PVC pipe. It's relatively cheap. It lasts a long time if you store it well in the winter. I mean, that's always the gripe that it doesn't last, but for us, it's lasted 5 years, 4 years now. Just depends on how well you take care of it. Metal conduit would be the more lasting investment. And if you do go with the metal conduit, you'll want to get a bender with it. And you can, again, those are available at Lowe's or anywhere, any greenhouse sites. It's a pretty popular method, and you can bend the hoops to however tall or short you want them. And we might save all the details for another workshop, but a good way to attach those pipes to your beds. So those EMT straps, those are those little metal clamps that you can just screw right into the bed. Most of the community gardens had those at one point. We find that pieces of rebar, if you pound them into the ground like 1.5 feet I'd say like every 2 to 4 feet along the length of your bed, depending on how big your bed is, are really ideal because you can just slip those PVC pipes right over standard rebar, and then you can make a pretty nice hoop across it. If you need an example of that, stop by the greenhouses that are over at Whole Foods and feel free to walk around. That's how we set up our whole system. So we have rebar every 4 feet, and then you can just slide the hoop right over the rebar and make a hoop across with that. And we will have some links available to some good guides on how to do that. But that's pretty sturdy. That'll withstand wind. It won't, pull out of the wood scraps or whatever. And then within that, again, depending on the length of the bed and how stable you want it, you can purchase some webbing. Again, they have like bulk webbing at Murdoch's. It's pretty easy to do, and you can make a spine or bracing for your hoops by wrapping the webbing around each hoop. And again, if there's enough interest, we might maybe talk about that in another series of how to do that. And then what to cover your hoops. So I feel like right now, there's all kinds of different options. People in this area are largely using plastic. I think that at best shift in how we're growing and an easier method is to move to row cover. A few reasons for that is that it's more forgiving. And by more forgiving, I mean, it's not going to fry your plants. So if you see how small this bed is, which might be the average size bed in a backyard setting or in a community garden, you might not always be able to get there to open it up, like in this plastic example. And in the heat of the summer, I'm sure you guys have all had plants fry or whatever if you're using that kind of system. With the row cover, it does a few things. It can act as shade. And so there's different grades and variants of row cover. And again, that's a little more advanced, but you can kind of explore that on your own. It's so it acts as frost protection. It offers some shade. It's breathable, and it offers wind protection. And so that cover that we've experimented with shade cloth. We've experimented with row cover over shade cloth, and then along with the plastic. The best bet for our outdoor beds has been the heavier duty row covers that can withstand. They're more durable. So by heavier duty, I mean they'll offer at least 4 to 5 degrees of frost protection, and they're usually around 70% translucent transparency, which means 30% shade. So 30 to 40% shade, which seems to be the ideal for growing veggies outside at this altitude. And so we've played around with that quite a bit, and that's kind of where we're at right now. So I guess 1.5 ounce is the one I like to use outside. And then you can vent it when it's hot. You can get a little air in there, but you can close it when it's windy, and it's going to keep your plants shaded. So this is, I think, the key to where everyone needs to start moving to. It's relatively inexpensive. It's reusable. And you can pair it with plastic, and you can layer it with plastic. But start exploring some options for row cover. I think that it's going to help people a lot more than the plastic is kind of hit or miss depending on your situation. So, and then of course there's shade cloth, but again, like depending on what you invest in, there's different realms of shade. 50% is the max shade you need. That was what that white covering is at the greenhouses we have, is a bit much for most crops. So I would recommend more like 30 to 40% shade max. And that should give you a good overall, like a generic shading for most vegetables. Do-it-yourself cold frames. We're not going to get into that too much, but you can use old windows. Make sure that you vent them because you can fry your plants. And yeah, so that's about it for kind of season extension. I'm sure there'll be more questions about that, but we've explored a lot of options, and I'm happy to answer people's questions about that. So moving into growing, we are a cool season area, if you didn't know that. And some people asked about zones. Zones are really hard. Technically, we're like zone 4B, but there's so many microclimates here that I don't really think that to follow that as a rule of thumb is a good guide. We've set up some planting guides for everyone to follow. So I'm just going to go through this real quick and then we'll click over to that. So these cool season veggies, these are the ones you want to start with if you've never grown vegetables before. They're frost tolerant. You can start planting basically now. So the first week of May is when we start planting for the CSA. It's a good rule of thumb. We went through crappy weather. The soil has time to dry out a bit. You don't want to plant if your soil is saturated and you can still like squeeze water out of it. Biggest thing about when to plant that I can offer you as your best tool to become a better grower in the high country is to get a soil thermometer. They're $5 to $10. You can use a meat thermometer if you've got one in your kitchen. Just make sure the temperatures go as low as 32, which if your soil is frozen, you won't be able to get it in there anyway. But in this one, it's kind of nice because this is the temperature at which those cold season vegetables start to germ, which is like 40 degrees soil temp. So you want to measure your soil temperature around 8 in the morning. You can stick it in about 4 inches deep. These rods are usually around 6 inches deep. And then you can start to get a feel for your soil temperatures. I mean, you can even measure it, several different times of the day, check it, see how it warms up. I like to take an average temp, but so far consistently with growing, the first week of May is, and even the end of April, you might want to start, but then your soil might still be wet. So as a good guide, start with this. And then so that way, if you have a soil thermometer, you can more easily follow guides for when to plant. So I'm going to show you right now one of these guides that we've put together for you. And you can read here what kind of vegetables that includes. So all your root veggies, beets, carrots, radishes, broccolis, cabbages, all the greens, spinaches, lettuce, everything, arugula, Asian greens. A lot of Asian greens are super cold tolerant and really tasty. So those are a lot we've been growing lately. When we say minimum soil temp for germination, this means that the seeds will not germinate if the temperatures are below this. So I'm going to take you to that next slide in a minute. But carrots, for example, are one of the first things that we plant because they germinate at 41 degrees Fahrenheit. And as the soil warms, their germination rate will increase. So for things like a tomato seed, it's not going to, and we'll get into that in a second, but it's not going to germ at temperature of 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's not really technical, but this is the most important thing I can say. Again, I can't stress enough, just get a soil thermometer and you'll start to see like what that means. And by semi-hardy plants, it means they can be damaged by frost, but generally they'll be okay. So potatoes, for example, here have had a few instances where we get them in early and then we have a late May or late June frost. And so they just come up and the frost kills the foliage of the plant and that can set it back and you can lose that. So I always cover potatoes now. So let me bring you to that guide here. So we've set up this guide for you, and this will be available readily on the website, and then we'll email it all to you. Put a bit of time into updating it, and take time to read through the notes. It'll give you a lot, but talking about soil temperature in here, again, the minimum soil temp for germination for things that grow well here, went through and just put that all as a guide so you know what that looks like. And they're arranged by soil temperature. So if you're like, oh, I want to plant this week, let's check on the soil temp. I could probably plant lettuce, it's at 41 degrees, spinach is at 43 degrees, arugula. And it doesn't have to be that technical, but all these guys, like you can plant at the same time, basically. And that can kind of give you a vision of those planting dates. And with all that kind of stuff, I mean, unless you're really chomping at the bit to, grow inside vegetables, you can just straight direct seed that into the soil. So this is a really helpful guide. as we move through, and you'll see like the temperatures will increase, so you can just kind of plan your planting program according to that. And not that you're going to get super technical in your backyard, but it's a nice guide to see what that looks like. So that said, direct seeding is, let's see, get back here. Soil thermometer, check, buy one today. Your soils should generally be around 40 right now, but it really depends on where you live. And that's okay. So talking about where we live and your frost date. So there is no last day of frost here. People always ask me, when's the frost date? When's the frost date? There's none. So give up on that. So if you want to grow frost intolerant crops, warm season veggies, you have to cover them, or you have to have a greenhouse or hoop house. It's fun to experiment and see what you can do, but we've done a lot of that. We've gotten through it, and it's not going to be successful if you want to direct seed tomatoes, peppers. So if we're going to go back to, so warm season veggies here. Sorry if I'm skipping around, but they're fun to grow. They're good to eat, but they're definitely a little more advanced. And you can't just like throw the seed in the soil. You've got to start them inside, and they have to be covered every night. So if we're going to use an average last date of frost, it'll be around Father's Day, so June 15 to June 20. But again, like last year, we had a frost June 31, and that nipped our potatoes, and we lost a handful of them. So now I cover anything that's moderately frost tender to intolerant, like every night. So that's just depending on where you live. I mean, Frisco is probably a little warmer. If you're in Summit Cove, it's colder. You're in Blue River, it's cold. Breck, it's cold. So I just, if you want to be successful, stick to the cold season ones, unless you're like, you've got a greenhouse, or you're really going to be willing to put the effort into covering, uncovering, starting them inside, or buying starts. These are the warm season veggies. So things like cucumbers, summer squash, basil, tomatoes, peppers, all need to be started inside. You might start them outside and they might come up, but you're not going to get anything out of them. I'm just going to be straight with you on that. And then eggplant, unless you're dying to grow eggplant, I don't recommend it, but they take a lot of space, and they're super warm loving. Not going to go into melons and stuff. That's not even something I'm going to recommend growing here. The only kind of semi-warm season veggie that I would say direct seed would be beans. You can get a decent bean harvest out here, but just know that if you get that early, like August, if you get that August 15 frost, and your beans are just coming on, they'll probably lose them. So just be aware of that, and maybe try to make sure you keep them covered. They don't really do well transplanting, but you could try. I would just say direct seed them. They come up pretty quick, but I would cover those. So transplanting these guys after the danger of frost, again, I'm going to take you back to that guide so that you can see the other tab on here. So we've got this laid out for you. And again, this will be available to everyone. Seed starting dates. So I'm putting June 15th as the last date of frost, which again, that's like a guide, but I would say I've seen frosts come as late as June. They can come anytime. So just kind of use your discretion with your space. And just briefly how to go over this. So this gives you your crops. The W is for warm season. The star is for things that you can just direct seed. There was a question about direct seeding, or about starting root vegetables. Don't start carrots inside. They don't transplant well. You're going to get all kinds of tiny dancers and weird carrots. Just direct seed those guys, and you can see they're the first ones you can plant. So there's no sense in wasting your time starting them inside. The same for beets. They start at a really low temperature. I just think that for the home gardener, unless you're really set up to do your starts and whatnot, just direct seed your root veggies. That's the easiest thing to do. Greens are easy to start and whatnot, but anyway, here's a guide. So number of weeks to start seeds before transplanting them out. So this gives you how many weeks you should start it before your setting out date, which is on or around your last day of frost. So let's just take basil, for example. It says 6 weeks before you want to transplant it out. So starting around May 11 gives you 6 weeks prior to June 15. And it says the safe time to transplant it starts outside is 1 week after the frost freeze day. So that takes us to June 22nd. So if you're doing it directly outside, you can use this as a guide. So this is a good general guide that even I use for the CSA. So right now we've got broccoli going. See that April 20th guideline. It's just a really easy guide to follow. And if you have a different frost free date, you can kind of explore some seed starting calculators. So here we've got, this is Johnny Seeds. It's a really helpful website. I think you all can see it. But you can basically put in whatever last day of frost in here that you want. So for the CSA, we use June 1st because we have things undercover. And so we can get a 2-week jump on that. So if I do that, then it'll take you through and guide you to when to start your seeds inside. And the latest date that you should start them inside is that 2 date. And then the safe time to set the plants out relative to the date that you enter in there. And so if there's more questions about that, you can ask me, but this is a pretty thorough guide on when to start your seeds inside. And then you can just use a calendar to plan accordingly. So there's that. Since we're on seed starting, I'm just going to jump to that next slide. A lot of people ask about starting seeds. It seems to be a big question for everyone. So seed starting, depending on your setup, again, you can you can use any kind of container. Cell flats, like what you see here, are probably the easiest to work with, but you can use those little fiber pots. You can use egg crates, anything like that. If it says, plant the start with the pot around it, don't do that here because it's not going to break down in our soil. It's not wet enough. It's not humid enough. And those pots just end up staying around the plant. So whatever you plant it in, make sure that you remove it when you transplant it into the garden. I've just found a lot of old pots and stuff over time that just never break down. And so you want to make sure that take it out of the pot. Make sure your pots are the right size for what you're planting. You don't want it to be so big that you have this tiny little sprout in a giant container. That's why egg crates are a good guide. Drainage, you want to make sure they drain. It's really nice to have a tray that you can put underneath. So something like this, so that your cell container rests inside the tray. And then you can put a humidity dome over it for when you're germinating. So the best way to germinate inside, if you don't have a heat mat, that's fine, but try to put it in a warm space. It's just going to take longer for your seeds to germinate. Those heat mats are relatively inexpensive and they work really well. Your seeds will come up in like 3 to 5 days typically. But you want to make sure that as soon as they start to germinate, you take them off that heat mat because they don't need the heat anymore. And you want to make sure that you remove a humidity dome if you had one on there because you want to expose them to the air. And if you leave that humidity dome on for the entire duration of its little baby life until you transplant it outside, it's going to wilt and die as soon as it hits our 0% humidity air. So make sure that right as soon as that little guy comes up, you take those domes off, you take them off the heat, and then you put them in a well-lit window or under a light. There's all kinds of different options for light. I'm not going to get too much into that, but if you're at that phase, sure, you can kind of Google and figure out. We might do another class on that, but the thing about putting flats or containers in a window is that the plants might want to start to reach for light if it's not getting even light. And so they'll become leggy. So by leggy, I mean they'll start to get long and like stringy, and we want to keep the starts short and stout. So you want to make sure that the light source is pretty close to the seedlings, so they're not reaching. If they're starting to get really, really long and tall and skinny, they're going to struggle when you put them outside. They're going to struggle against the wind. They're not going to be as strong. So that's kind of important when you're starting seeds. And you can see here in this photo, all these little seedlings have come up. It's beautiful, but you have to thin them. And that's this is going to tie in with direct seeding. You must thin your plants. So just because I'm looking at this right now, you can see how all of these are in one cluster. There should only be one plant per space in here to be successful. I'm going to get into that in just a second as we move into thinning. But just be aware that if you do starts, you also have to thin them. So just to keep on track here, soil mixes, lots of people ask about what to put in their soil start mix. Most people are not going to make their own mix, so I'm not really going to go into that, but you can buy just a general seed starting mix. So this Pro Mix is a good one. It's a little more of a higher grade one. The key to look at, and I think you can see my mouse in here, is this OMRI symbol. OMRI means that it's certified organic. It has all the organic ingredients for your seed starting. So things like Miracle Grow and such, they have organic mixes now, but if you want to keep it organic, just make sure it says organic. Seed starting mix is best if it says like, flour mix or things for different, you want to keep it as a vegetable start mix. Just read the packaging. In general, the difference between a seed starting mix and a gardening mix is the seed starting mix is going to be it's going to be lighter. It's going to be more airy. It's going to have better drainage. And it's not going to be jam packed with as many nutrients as like a garden mix, because those little guys don't need all those nutrients. If you're doing things like peppers and tomatoes that are a little more advanced, you can explore some fertilizing options, but in general, these mixes have enough nutrients to get those babies from start to transplant without having to add fertilizer. I don't fertilize our starts, and they do fine. And so just depending on how long they're going to be in those cells, like peppers, I'd say like they're in a pot for 8 to 10 weeks. They'll need to be transplanted or potted up into a larger size pot. And then, and you might want to give them a little nutrients. But if you're just a beginner and you're just starting, I don't even bother with fertilizers and see how that goes. I just think that that's usually unnecessary, and they kind of get misused. So, and then label, you want to label all your plants, so you know what you got going. Where am I? And okay, so watering your seed start mix. So when you start planting and when you fill your containers, you want to make sure that the soil is moist enough so that you can make a ball, like it feels like a sponge, but not so wet that you can squeeze water out of it. So it should feel kind of like a new sponge. So it shouldn't be too wet and it shouldn't be too dry. And then that way you can fill your containers appropriately. And you want to make sure that they're all filled evenly so that when you water, they get the right amount of water. You want to pack them down a little bit too. So what we do when we fill a soil mix is you take a handful of soil, you can fill whatever your container is, and then we lift up, we use cell flats, like this guy on the cue for basil, like what you see, and you get everything filled and just kind of level it off without compacting. And then we drop it a few times. I don't know if you could see that, but you can drop it a few inches away from the floor just to pack it down a bit. And that usually does enough to settle the soil. And so that way you don't have all these like different heights and loose soil in that container. That makes sense. I hope it does. And then you want to just cover your seeds with a fine layer of seeding mix. Seed depth is really important. So for example, let's take basil. I know there was a question about basil. Basil's a really tiny seed. If you're going to start it inside, make sure that you're not putting that seed like an inch into your container. So basil generally likes to be about a quarter inch, an eighth of an inch deep. So if you need to refer to a ruler, which we often do, just to get a guide for what that is, use a ruler and see how deep that is. And that's not very deep at all. So when you're planting seeds inside and outside, seeding depth is really important. And that info can be found on the seed packet. And I don't think it's on that handout that we'll have, but anyway, that's this, it could be found in the seed packet. So this is a really good visual guide for how to read a seed packet. This, how do I plant this variety? It has all the info that you need. So if you zoom in, I think you can zoom in on that. It gives you that seeding depth. So here for tomatoes, for example, it says quarter inch deep. So you don't want to be putting that seed in that's an inch deep, and then that's really going to affect how it can germinate. So that's really important too. So all that information can be found basically on any seed packet you have. This is Botanical Interests. They're out of Boulder. This is a good company to look at, and I think they still seem to have a lot of seeds. A lot of seed companies are sold out of seed right now, but these are readily available at Whole Foods and natural grocers is where I've seen them recently. And they have a decent selection. So read the seed packet and don't plant the seeds too deep. That's a big reason why I think people's seeds don't germinate. It's because you just kind of willy-nilly throw them in there pretty deep, and they won't emerge. So keep that in mind. And then when you're watering, so watering is actually a bigger challenge than you think with seedlings. And I've had challenges getting through that, but it's kind of a fine line. So you want to keep the soil moist as they're germinating. Once they all emerge, you want to continue to keep them moist, but not too wet. And so that's a fine line, and that's only kind of comes with practice. I like to use a little mister. So there's these little misting spray waterers that you can get at Lowe's. Mine's in the other room, but I would show you otherwise. It gives just a nice fine mist over everything, but you want to make sure that you're saturating it. Again, it's really kind of hard to teach, but just keep an eye on them. So if you see the soil drying out throughout the day, that means you need to start adding more water in the morning. Or sometimes as they start to get bigger in these cell containers, you need to start doing morning and night. And one really good method that will keep your plants healthy and does the most uniform watering is bottom watering. And so bottom watering works well. Hold on. Oh, sorry, babe. If you have a tray that you can put your flat in, or that you can put your seedlings in, so these trays work really well. And whatever kind of container you're using, you can line in here, and you kind of want to have them up above, which is why it's nice to use the cell flats with it. I'm getting a little technical right now, but you can fill that tray with water, and then the root zone will suck up the water from the bottom up. And so that way you're not getting mold, and like sometimes if you see the green moss forming on top of your soil, you want to avoid that. That will just lead to disease, and it's kind of unhealthy for the plants. So the best way to get around that is to fill the bottom of a tray and set your plants in there, and then they'll suck it up from the bottom. So if you're going away for a couple of days, or you get no one to water, you can kind of just play with that and see, how quickly your starts and such dry out. I don't want to spend too much time on starts because we're coming into time. So we're going to cruise through the rest of this. Reading a seed packet, tons of info. I'm not sure if we need to go to questions now, Rachel.
Yeah, I saw you just skip past a slide on square foot gardening. I know we did have a question about how to maximize your bed. So maybe if you're willing to talk about that briefly. And then we did have a couple questions come through and through the RSVP.
Okay. So sorry that I got carried away with some of that stuff, because this is actually the most important thing, but these will be available for viewing anyway. So intensive spacing, block style. Basically, the way that is you're equally spacing the distance that your plants are in the bed. So for example, here, these kohlrabis are 6 inches apart. So you just want to put one seed, you want to have one plant per 6 inches. And this gives you a pretty good guide around here. So I've seen some people use string and twine to map out their garden bed. So like here, for example, if you're only growing whatever that is, corn, or beans, you want to have it all equally spaced in a 4x4 inch spacing. And I know that I don't know if that sounds confusing to most people, but if you plant a row of carrots, for example, and you're thinning your carrots, you want to make sure that you have one carrot per every 2 inches. So the spacing in between two carrot plants should be about 2 inches of seed. And all those spacings are on that guide that we have. And so when I say 4x4 inch spacing, it means equally around that plant. When you thin the plant, you're going to have a 4 inch spacing. It's hard without having live questions here to kind of explain through that. But this guide really explains it well. And then, so like thinning. So here, for example, these are carrots. If you see here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, all these carrots. These are the hardest things to thin. And this is why a lot of people fail with carrots. You want to have one carrot per 2 inches on each side of it. So if you kind of visualize the diameter of a carrot in the ground, it needs that much space to grow to full size. If you leave your carrots like this because it looks like a nice bushy row and you're so excited that everything came up, they're not going to grow. And you're going to have minuscule carrots because they don't have enough space to grow if they're all clustered in together. So the most important thing is to learn how to thin and to learn what it looks like to have one plant per space. So these two, if you can see my mouse, have a space in between that looks appropriate, that looks to be about 2 inches, and then 2 inches to the next. These two are really close. You need to pull out one of those. And just real quick about thinning. So the first leaves that come up on your plants are these little guys, the cotyledons, and then you have true leaves. And you want to be able to distinguish what that looks like in your plants, and that's really helpful for thinning. So you can kind of take a look at this slide. And then this carrot one's really helpful too, to see like what a carrot looks like, and what you need to do to thin, if that makes sense.
So I'm just going to dive right into questions because I know we are running up on time. We got a question about thoughts about adding peat to a raised bed in the soil.
If you're doing a raised bed out in your yard, depending on what your topsoil, if your topsoil is real clay, peat helps for moisture retention. So the average garden bed, if you're doing, I guess I didn't touch too much on filling your raised bed. If you're doing like a 50-50 topsoil compost, that should be adequate. And I don't think you would need any more moisture retention in that. Usually the peat is designed for starting cells inside. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend putting that in an outdoor bed. So outdoor beds, that the mix, you want to use about 40 to 50% topsoil, or 50 to 60% topsoil, 40 to 50% compost. The compost that's available at the Summit County landfill is really good for growing veggies. So they've got bulk compost for a really economical rate. And I know that there are raised bed mixes available because topsoil can be hard to find here. Currently, there's a raised bed mix available at Niels Lunsford as the last I knew. So scrap is great for compost to amend your bed each year and to start it out. You can find your own topsoil, but yeah, I wouldn't recommend adding peat to the bed.
Great, thanks, Kyla. And then that compost is all certified by the EPA, by the U.S. Compost Council. So it does pass a lot of quality tests. We did get another question about aphids. No matter where I put them in my house, in basil, I get aphids. What can I do to keep aphids out? And then another question kind of alongside that, are aphids okay on outdoor herbs?
So aphids in general are not okay because they're going to take over everything. They're like bulls, except worse. Um, so no, some herbs are natural aphid repellents. Well, God, even that mint used to be. They can just take over anywhere, really. Um, the best thing for aphids is to use a soapy water. So you use water to put a drop of soap in it and spray your plants. You can blast them with water. If you have a really heavy infestation and you can't get rid of them, I get rid of the plants, get rid of the soil, and just start new. It's not really worth your while to like hang on to a couple plants that are infested. They can just take over. The heavy hitter is pyrethrin. It's organic. Pyganic is the brand name of it. It's a little expensive, but that's the heaviest hitter we use as an organic method if we're having a really bad outbreak. Ladybugs are another good option if your infestation isn't too bad. Introduce some ladybugs out there. They love to eat aphids, so they'll feast on that, and they're fun to have in the garden. And you can order those online. Just you can probably just Google that. Neem oil is okay, but I think it's more like it can work, but it's more like you have to stay on top of it quite a bit. So spraying and really staying on top of it. And if the infestation is super bad, you might want to look at all your plants and, they spread really easily. So early and often is the best key for that. And sometimes it's just a losing battle and you have to throw in the towel and start over. So.
So I know we're about to reach time. Kyla, if you want to go to that last slide, if you guys are willing, I think we're probably happy to stay on the phone to answer some more questions because I do see a couple more coming through. Some resources. So we are going to email all these workshop materials as well as some of those things that Kyla showed, like these plant guides. Here's some links. We'll also send these out. To the community gardens, to compost, and also we got a couple questions about pollinator gardens and other types of flowers. The CSU extension is a really great resource. They have a feature called Ask an Expert. It's everything from like yard turf to pollinator friendly gardens to fruits and veggies. So it's a really cool resource. And they also have a lot of plant guides for vegetables and all manner of plants that grow in the high country. Also, too, now that you guys are all basically experts, when all the harvesting begins and you get to a point where you can't handle any more bok choy, don't let it go to waste. We work with Summit County WIC and the FERC to donate fresh produce to families in need. And then together we teach folks how to prepare and store all different kinds of fresh produce. So this is called Grow to Share, and I'll also include some of that info in my follow-up email. So if you find that you love gardening, or maybe you already do, grow more and donate what you're not going to eat, because Grow to Share is a really, really cool community partnership. Again, highcountryconservation.org, a lot of great resources.